Video games have come a long way since they've been around, be that improvements to the hardware, the graphics, or the gameplay. And regardless of any limitations they might have had, some of these games are still incredibly fun to play, which is what I would like to talk about today. And I would like to give a quick shout out to QWERTYUP536 for the video idea, but before we start there are two rules for this list. The first one is that all of these games have to have come out before 2006. The second rule is that the gameplay I'm going to show you is the gameplay from that specific game, not the remake or remaster of that game. And with that out of the way, here are some games that I still think hold up in 2024.
Fallout 1, developed and published by Interplay Entertainment. Before I go too deep into this entry, I will state that your mileage with Fallout 1 will vary depending on your interest with CRPGs in general, and not everything in this game is held up, which is why I placed it so early in the video. Game design was still in its infancy in 1997, so there wasn't much standardization for control schemes and button layouts. And the UI, although I would say is fairly straightforward, could have been better. And this was back in the day where games came with manuals more than tutorials, so learning the mechanics came with a college degree. But we've got things like YouTube and stuff now, so it is still easy enough to learn. But regardless of that, Fallout 1 is still an incredible game, especially for its time. Its story is probably one of my favourites in the whole series, with atmosphere and world building that sucks you straight in. The art design is still very nice, with many things still being recognisable up into the later releases, although obviously being updated for modern graphics. And it's easily one of the best role-playing experiences you can get to this day, like the fate of Junktown, whether or not you should send water shipments to your vault, or the sheer amount of dialogue options that instead of being blacked out, just doesn't show unless you have the appropriate skill level, which gives you the want to go back and try different builds. There's so many things that make you feel like you are part of this world and draw you in. It was a landmark in gaming that was cited as reviving the CRPG genre, and has been an influence on most RPGs that came after it. And if you ever want to go back and try this absolute classic, or its sequel, you can find it on Xbox Game Pass for PC or on Steam. Pokémon LeafGreen and FireRed, developed by Game Freaks and published by Nintendo. I'm not a huge fan of Nintendo or anything. I do enjoy some of their games, but generally speaking I wouldn't consider myself a Nintendo fanboy, but I have always been a big fan of Pokémon, from sitting in the back of my parents' car as a child with a torch on my Game Boy so I could see what the hell was going on, to crying my eyes out at that one scene in the first movie. Pokémon has always had mass appeal because of its simplistic yet fun design and easy to understand story. The reason I went with the remakes though instead of the original is because it was exactly what a remake should be. A few tweaks to the mechanics and battle system to keep it up to date with modern standards, new Pokémon, areas and story beats added to expand its world, and upgraded visuals and added colour to really make your pocket monsters pop. But part of why I think this game holds up so well when compared to some of the other more popular games in the series is because for any long-time Pokémon fan, it's a fun and faithful trip down memory lane that's able to replicate its original experience in a way more similar to how our brains usually remember things we used to love as kids. But for newcomers isn't too overwhelming with its amount of Pokémon you're able to catch, or with how the battle system is designed. And thanks to the visuals being colourful 2D sprites, the graphics never really come across as feeling aged or dated. Sadly, it's not really available to purchase on the Nintendo store, but if you ever feel like becoming a Pokémon master for the 100th or even the first time, then you can't go wrong with this title, provided you have an old Game Boy Advanced, SP or original Nintendo DS, or, you know, some other way to play it. The Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, developed and published by EA Games. If this was released today, EA would probably add in DLC and microtransactions for something stupid like how much hair your Hobbit feet could have. But back in 2003, Return of the King was one of the best movie tie-in games. And although that wasn't exactly much of a competition, it genuinely was a really fun game that translated the epic fights and dramatic story into a video game format really well. Its simplistic approach to certain RPG mechanics and special moves allowed this game to be exactly what it needed to be, a way to let fans of the wider series experience some of the greatest moments from the films themselves by playing through it. The controls were well put together, the graphics were really nice for the time, and the separate paths for Gandalf, Sam and Frodo, and Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli let you play as all your favourite characters, with some extra characters able to be unlocked along the way. Now, I have to admit I have some biases towards anything Lord of the Rings, as ever since I was a tiny little goblin myself, I've been a fan of Tolkien's work, and I will forever annoy my wife by telling her about Viggo's foot in that one scene of Two Towers every time we watch it. But I personally think most of the franchise's video game adaptations were generally anywhere between good and great, with a personal favourite being The Third Age, as it was my first proper experience with a more traditional JRPG, which led me towards games like Final Fantasy and Persona, but it is generally agreed upon by most people that Return of the King was the best game in the world of Tolkien licensed works. Sadly though, this is once again a game where you're going to need the original copy or come up with some other method of playing it, as the games aren't available in any of the current online game stores. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, developed by Neversoft and published by Activision. Released in the year 2000 on the OG PlayStation, I decided to go with Pro Skater 2 because although Pro Skater 1 was also a phenomenal game, I believe Pro Skater 2 is what really defined the series. Adding in manuals, more types of grinds, Create a Skater, and the Park Editor. It was the epitome of radical baggy pants punk rock blaring coolness for a lot of people. Its fast-paced arcade style of gameplay and Warped Tour inspired soundtrack opened the eyes of young people all over the world, leading to thousands of kids getting a skateboard and quickly realizing it's a lot harder in real life, so they should go back inside and keep playing the game instead. But critics and fans applauded the game for its well thought out controls, tight level design, and at the time, really good graphics, with it holding the #1 spot on Metacritic's best PS1 games. But for me, this game was a lot more than just fun. It was a turning point in a lot of who I am now. Don't get me wrong, going back to it now, the characters look like paper mache that got sat on by a dog, but that doesn't change just how much fun the game still is. Sadly, it isn't particularly easy to go back and play unless you're playing the remake, which is pretty much the exact same game but with better graphics. But there's just something about playing the original, warts and all, that is just so damn satisfying. So if you have, or are able to get a copy of the original game, I can't recommend it enough. Max Payne, developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by Gathering of Developers and Rockstar Games. Released back in 2001, Max Payne received generally positive reviews, with Max Payne's signature facial expression and the super satisfying bullet time being a couple of things that really stuck with players. Personally, I was a big fan of Max Payne back on the original Xbox. Its dark themes and tragic characters mixed with its intense gameplay and graphic novel style of storytelling made it super compelling, even if I did find some levels super hard, and there was one specific level that will stick with my nightmares until I leave this mortal coil. But it was still a really engrossing game. I'm not going to pretend that the graphics haven't aged like milk, but the gameplay still feels really tight and satisfying. The bullet time is still every flavour of cool and badass as I remember, and the story is a dark, moody and interesting experience that would still be captivating if it came out today. I also think looking back at Max Payne is a really good way of seeing Remedy Entertainment's quality in design and narrative, as even their most recent games like Control or Alan Wake 2, although having their differences, share a lot of that signature Remedy style fans have come to know from the developers. Although the game's not spoken about as much as some of the other games in the list, I still think it deserves its place in the Video Game Hall of Fame, and with a remake of it and its sequel in the works, it's definitely worth a look. Max Payne can be found on Steam, the PlayStation Store, and the Microsoft Store, although I guess if you feel like punishing yourself, you can also find it on iOS and the Google Play Store. Super Mario World, developed and published by Nintendo. Although the Mario series isn't exactly up there on my favourite video game list, I think I'd deserve a roasting in the comments for not including a Mario game. Although I'll probably still get roasted for not picking Mario Bros. 3, Mario 64, or Super Mario RPG. But I can't deny how incredible this game was back in 1990, with it being the best-selling game on the SNES, and how incredible it still was 11 years later when it was ported to the Game Boy Advance. And even now, another 23 years later, people still consider it one of the greatest games of all time. It's such an easily recognizable game for multiple generations of gamers. Its vibrant artwork is burned into our brains like a plasma screen that's been left on pause. The soundtrack is super catchy and memorable, the controls are tight and easy to understand. And let's not forget that this was Yoshi's first appearance, and sending him to his doom each time you need some extra height in a jump is etched into the mind of everyone that played it. But the reason I think this game still holds up today, other than what I've already mentioned, is the exact same reason they're still making the 2.5D Mario games today. The gameplay is so cathartic and satisfying. It's easy enough to get a grip on how to play, but offers enough challenge that completing levels still gives you that sense of accomplishment, and its concept is perfect for gamers of almost any age, making it a perfect way to introduce your grandma or your kids into one of your favourite hobbies, while experiencing it with them thanks to the 2-player mode. If you're interested in going back to this old classic, you can find Super Mario World on the SNES Classic or the Nintendo Switch Online store. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, developed and published by Ubisoft. Now, to quickly draw attention to the fact that some people were not happy with a previous video I done about stealth games, I picked Splinter Cell Double Agent, the Xbox 360 version to be specific. And as much as I completely understand why people were unhappy with it, I'm going to stand by that choice, as it's the game that really got me into the series and led me to experience the other games. But taking off my nostalgia goggles for a minute, Chaos Theory is probably one of the best stealth games ever made, with one of its few competitors probably being something like Thief. But Chaos Theory holds up insanely well by today's standards. Its graphics aren't super flashy or anything, but that's probably worked in its favour, as it's still a very good looking game. Especially considering that in 2024 it's just shy of being 20 years old. Also, the sound design, use of lighting, and the general gameplay mechanics made this an absolute staple of stealth games when it released, with Michael Ironside's voice talents being the little cherry on top of what was already a pretty incredible experience. After scrolling through some online discussions about the game, it seems most people agree that the better way to play it is on the PC with mouse and keyboard. I personally don't find the controls too bad, but I felt it's worth pointing out in case you're looking for the best experience possible. It can be found on Steam, Epic Games, or the Ubisoft store. That's the video. Why don't you let me know what games you still think hold up? And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me out with the algorithm gods. And I'll see you in the next video.